The laughter hit Naomi Cross before she even touched the ground. She was still on the train steps, one hand gripping the iron rail, the other clutching a carpet bag that held everything she owned in this world. When she heard it, a sharp, ugly burst of sound that cut through the dry wind of Ash Ridge like a blade. She looked up. A cluster of men stood on the platform, and one of them, stocky, sunburned, with a sheriff's badge pinned crooked on his chest, was pointing directly at her, not gesturing, pointing, the way you'd point at something that didn't belong. "Lord Almighty," he said, loud enough that the whole platform could hear. "Silas Mercer sent for that?" The laughter spread. Naomi stood there on the bottom step of that train, one foot hovering above the soil of a town she'd traveled 4 days to reach, and she made herself breathe. She made herself keep her chin level. She'd rehearsed what she would say when she arrived. She'd imagined shaking hands with a quiet man, maybe sharing an awkward supper, slowly building something. She had not imagined this. She had not imagined being pointed at before she'd said a single word. If you've ever walked into a room and felt every eye telling you that you don't belong, that your very presence is somehow wrong, then you know what Naomi felt on that step. If you've ever swallowed something sharp and kept walking anyway, then you already know what kind of woman she was. Before we go further, if stories like this one speak to something true in you, take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button and drop a comment below telling us what city or country you're watching from, because I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Ash Ridge and to the woman everyone underestimated. Naomi Cross had not been a beautiful woman in the way that the world of 1883 rewarded beauty. She knew that. She had always known that. She was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, heavy-set, with work-rough hands and a face that had never been described as delicate. In the eastern city she'd come from, Cincinnati, Ohio, where she'd spent 8 years keeping house for her widowed aunt before the woman died and left her nothing but a roof over her head that wasn't hers. She had learned early that certain doors didn't open for women who looked like her. Certain men didn't tip their hats. Certain opportunities didn't present themselves. She was not soft about this. She didn't weep over it. She simply saw it clearly, the way you see a fence line and decide which side you're standing on. When the letter from the frontier came, routed through a matchmaking agency in Columbus, she'd read it twice and then set it on the kitchen table and stared at the wall for a long time. Silas Mercer, rancher, Ash Ridge Territory, seeks a practical woman. Not a young woman, not a beautiful woman, a practical one. He'd written plainly, in a hand that was steady and unornate. "I need someone who can work alongside me. I'm not looking for romance. I'm looking for a partner." He had listed the realities without softening them. Hard winters, isolated land, no neighbors closer than 6 miles. He'd written, "I won't lie to you about what this is." She had written back the same way. She told him her age. She told him she wasn't delicate. She told him she could cook, sew, manage accounts, ride a horse passably, and work from before dawn until after dark without complaint. She did not tell him she was afraid. She did not tell him that the apartment she was living in belonged to a cousin who barely tolerated her presence and had started making pointed comments about the cost of feeding an extra mouth. He wrote back in 2 weeks. "Come west. I'll meet you at the station." She had taken that letter out and read it so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. And now here she was, standing on the bottom step of the Ash Ridge platform, and a man with a lopsided badge was pointing at her like she was a mistake somebody had shipped by accident. She stepped down onto the platform. The laughter didn't stop. If anything, it grew. There were maybe 15 people visible, some waiting for the train, some who appeared to have simply drifted over to see what came off it. She could hear pieces of what they were saying. Silas must have been desperate. Did the agency run out of women? Lord, she's a big one. A woman in a blue dress turned away and pressed her lips together, but she didn't say anything to stop it either. Naomi set her carpet bag down on the platform boards. She straightened her coat. And she stood very still, because she had learned long ago that moving too fast when people were watching you like this only gave them more to comment on. That was when she saw him. He was standing at the far end of the platform, slightly apart from the rest, and he was not laughing. He was a tall man, lean through the shoulders but thick in the forearms, with a hat pulled low and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same red stone as the hills behind him. He was watching the men who were laughing, not her, them. And his expression was not one of embarrassment or of a man pretending not to notice. It was something quieter and harder than that. He walked toward her. He walked directly through the middle of the laughing group, and something about the way he moved, not fast, not aggressive, just absolutely certain, made the laughter die down in stages, the way a fire goes out section by section when you starve it of air. He stopped in front of her. "Miss Cross," he said. His voice was low and even. "I'm Silas Mercer. I apologize for being late." He had not been late. The train had arrived exactly on schedule, and he had been standing on this platform. She understood immediately what he was doing, giving her something to stand on, an excuse, a small piece of ground, and she was surprised enough by the gesture that she almost said the wrong thing. "It's no trouble," she said instead. "The train was early." Something moved in his eyes. Not quite a smile. More like recognition. He picked up her carpet bag before she could reach for it. "I've got a wagon out front," he said. "It's a fair ride to the ranch." He turned and walked, and Naomi followed him off the platform, and behind them she could hear the murmuring start up again. Quieter now, confused by what they'd seen. She kept her eyes forward. The wagon ride was almost entirely silent, and not in a comfortable way. Naomi sat on the bench beside him and watched the land open up, wide and spare, the grass already browning at the edges, the hills in the distance purple with shadow. It was not ugly, but it was nothing like any landscape she'd known. It felt, in a way that she couldn't quite put into words, like the land itself was waiting to find out whether she deserved to be on it. Silas drove with the reins loose in his hands, his eyes on the trail ahead. He'd said maybe 6 words since the platform. Finally, she said, "You didn't have to do that." "Do what?" "Lie. About being late." His jaw shifted slightly. "I wasn't lying. I should have been earlier. Should have been standing right there when you stepped down." She looked at him. He was staring at the trail. "They weren't going to stop on their own," he said. "Men like that don't stop until somebody makes it less interesting." "I've handled worse," she said. "I don't doubt it." He was quiet for a moment. "Doesn't mean you should have had to handle it today." Naomi turned that over for a while. It was not a declaration of anything. It was not warmth, exactly. It was closer to something she hadn't received much of in her life. A plain acknowledgement that a wrong thing had happened. No softening. No, it wasn't that bad, or people out here are just curious. Just, it was wrong, and I should have prevented it. She found herself not knowing what to do with that, which was uncomfortable in its own way. "I want to be clear about something," she said, because she'd learned that clarity early prevented a great deal of pain later. "All right. I didn't come out here because I had no options. I came because this one seemed like a reasonable opportunity for both parties." She kept her voice even. "I'm not fragile. I'm not going to need constant protection. I'm going to work hard, and I expect to be treated fairly. And if at any point either of us decides this arrangement isn't working, I'd rather know than not know." Silas was quiet for long enough that she wondered if she'd said something wrong. "That's fair," he finally said. "Same goes for me." They drove another half-mile before he said, "The ranch house needs work. I want you to know that before you see it." "How much work?" "The east wall has a gap where the wind gets in. Roof over the lean-to needs patching before snow season. Floorboards in the kitchen are soft in 2 places." He paused. "I've been managing the animals and the land. The house has suffered for it." "How long have you been out here alone?" 3 years. She did the math without asking more. 3 years after whatever loss had made him write that letter to a matchmaking agency in Ohio. 3 years of a man managing land and animals and not the house, which was what you did when keeping the practical things alive was all you had the capacity for. She didn't push it. "I can work on the house," she said. "I'd like to know the land first, though. Get a sense of what we're actually managing before I start making decisions about what the priorities are." This time, when he glanced over at her, there was something almost surprised in it. "All right," he said. "Tomorrow morning, if you're not too worn from the travel." "I'll be fine," she said. The ranch came into view around a long curve in the trail, and it was, honestly, rougher than she'd hoped and better than she'd feared. The main house was small but solid, built from timber and stone in a way that suggested whoever had laid the foundation knew what they were doing. The outbuildings were worn but standing. There were cattle visible in a far pasture, and a pair of horses in the yard that lifted their heads when the wagon came through the gate. It looked like a place that was barely holding on. It also looked like a place that could be something if the right amount of work was put into it. Naomi stepped down from the wagon before Silas could come around to help her, not out of stubbornness exactly, but out of habit, and stood in the yard and looked at it properly. "It's a good piece of land," she said. "It is," he agreed. The first week was harder than she'd expected, and she had expected it to be hard. The stove was a cast-iron beast with a temperament all its own, ran too hot on one side, wouldn't hold a flame on the other unless you fed it exactly the right size and kind of wood, and the damper stuck unless you hit it at a specific angle that she only discovered by accident on the third morning. She burned 2 batches of biscuits before she got the temperature right. Silas ate the burned ones without comment, which she decided was either politeness or genuine indifference to the quality of food, and she wasn't sure which. The water pump in the yard had to be primed every morning, which meant hauling a bucket from the rain barrel first, which meant the rain barrel needed to be positioned correctly, which it wasn't. She moved it herself on the second afternoon, dragging it 6 feet across the yard until it sat properly under the lean-to overhang. Her back ached for 2 days afterward. The floors in the kitchen were soft in 3 places, not 2, as Silas had said. She mapped them carefully on the first day so she didn't fall through one in the dark. She also discovered, on the 4th morning, that she genuinely did not know how to make a fire burn correctly in a fireplace that was drawing wrong. She stood in front of it for 20 minutes in the pre-dawn dark, feeding it and adjusting and getting nowhere, until Silas appeared in the doorway, still half asleep, his shirt untucked, and looked at it for about 4 seconds. "Flue's sticky," he said. "You have to push it up hard and then left." She tried it. The fire caught. "Thank you," she said. "You would have figured it out," he said. He didn't say it as a compliment or a dismissal. He said it as a plain fact, and then he went back to his room to finish waking up, and she stood there in the kitchen with the fire finally going and something tight in her chest that she couldn't quite name. She would have figured it out. Yes, probably, eventually. But it was something else, to have someone say so. She met Damon Mercer on the 6th day. He came to the ranch in the late afternoon, riding a horse that was better than anything in Silas's yard, and he came without announcement. Naomi was in the garden patch behind the house, or what might become a garden patch once she'd turned the soil and figured out what would actually survive the altitude, when she heard hoofbeats and then voices, and something in the tone of Silas's voice made her stop and listen. She couldn't make out the words, but she knew the sound of a man trying to keep his voice level in a conversation that was making him angry. She'd grown up in a house with enough of that to recognize it across any distance. She finished what she was doing and came around the side of the house. The man on the horse was younger than Silas, maybe by 5 or 6 years, and he had the same jaw, the same set of the shoulders, but where Silas's face was worn and weathered in a way that read as steady, this man's face was smooth in a way that read as something else. He was handsome. He knew he was handsome. There was a quality to his smile that reminded her of men she'd met in Cincinnati, men who sold things, not goods exactly, but versions of themselves, and sold them very well. He looked at her with the smile still in place and something else underneath it. "Well," he said, "so you're the woman Silas imported." "Naomi Cross," she said. "And you are?" "Damon Mercer." He touched his hat brim. "Little brother." "I see." Silas said, "Naomi, go inside." The way he said it, flat, low, made her understand that this was not about her. She went inside. But she stood near the window, not because she was the kind of woman who eavesdropped, but because she was the kind of woman who needed to understand what she had walked into. She heard Damon say clearly, "Doesn't change what Father's will actually says, Silas. You know that." She heard Silas say something she couldn't make out. She heard Damon say, pleasant as anything, "I'm just saying, it would be a shame to have all this work come to nothing. I'm only looking out for you." Then hoofbeats, and then silence, and then Silas came in through the back door and stood in the kitchen for a moment with his hands at his sides. "What was that about?" she asked. He looked at her. He seemed to be deciding something. "My father left the ranch jointly," he said finally. "Between me and Damon. Damon has been—" He stopped, started again. "Damon doesn't want a partnership. He wants the whole thing." And he has legal grounds. He thinks he does. She watched him. Do you have a lawyer? In Fallow Creek, 20 miles. Have you talked to him recently? The look on Silas's face told her he hadn't. That should probably be the next thing, she said carefully. He looked at her for a moment, not with gratitude, not with resistance, just that same quality of plain attention he gave to most things. And then he said, I'll ride out Friday. Good, she said. She turned back to the stove. Behind her, she heard him pull out a chair and sit down, and after a moment he said very quietly, He's going to be trouble. Yes, she said, I got that impression. She did not say, So will I, if he comes after what's yours. She didn't say it because it wasn't the right moment for it, and because she had learned that certain things carried more weight when you showed them rather than said them. But she thought it. The evening light through the kitchen window was going gold and flat, and the stove was finally holding its heat the way she wanted it to, and somewhere in the distance one of the horses was moving in the corral. Naomi Cross stood in the kitchen of a rough house on a rough piece of land at the edge of the frontier and thought, All right then, all right. She had not come all this way to be driven out before she'd properly arrived. Silas rode to Fallow Creek on Friday, like he said he would, and Naomi spent the day alone on the ranch for the first time. It was not a comfortable day. Not because she was afraid of being alone. Heck, she'd been alone most of her adult life in ways that had nothing to do with geography, but because the ranch without Silas in it felt different, larger somehow, more aware of all the things that could go wrong. The wind picked up around mid-morning and found every gap in the east wall she already knew about, plus two she hadn't discovered yet, and she spent an hour pressing old rags into the cracks with the flat of her hand and telling herself this was productive work and not displacement activity because she didn't know what to do with the quiet. She got the kitchen floor patched in the afternoon, not properly. She didn't have the right lumber for a proper job, but she found boards in the lean-to that were close enough in thickness, and she pulled the soft ones up and cut the replacements down with a handsaw she found hanging on a nail in the barn, and by the time the light started going orange, she had a floor that didn't give under her feet anymore. Her hands were raw from the saw, and her back was complaining in a specific and pointed way, but she stood on the new boards and pressed her weight down, and they held. She was standing there still pressing her boot against the wood like it might change its mind, when she heard the wagon. Silas came in through the back door with mud on his boots and something in his face that she'd learned, in 10 days, to read as bad news being processed into manageable pieces. She set a plate in front of him without being asked. He sat down and looked at it for a moment before he looked at her. Lawyer says the will is ambiguous, he said. Those were his words. Ambiguous. Meaning what, practically? Meaning Damon has a case if he wants to make one. The language about joint ownership doesn't specify what happens if one party wants to dissolve the arrangement. He picked up his fork and then set it back down. My father wrote it himself, didn't use a lawyer, thought he was being straightforward. Naomi sat down across from him. What would dissolving the arrangement mean for you? He could force a sale or a buyout. Silas looked at the plate. I don't have money for a buyout. She was quiet for a moment. Does he know that? Damon knows everything about my finances. He's always made it his business too. That sat between them for a moment, and then Silas picked up his fork again and started eating, because a man who'd worked a ranch for 3 years alone didn't stop eating because things were bad. He'd learned to eat while things were bad. It was one of the basic survival skills. What did the lawyer recommend? She asked. Document everything. Every improvement, every acre worked, every season's output. Make the case that I'm the active steward of the property. He chewed, swallowed. And he said, he stopped. What? Silas looked at her with something careful in his expression. He said that a married man with a settled household has stronger standing in a property dispute. Courts out here take a dim view of breaking up a family ranch. Naomi understood immediately what he was saying and what he wasn't saying. So our arrangement has legal value to you. I want to be honest with you about that. I appreciate it. She meant it. Does it change anything for how the ranch is actually run? No. Then we document everything and we keep working. She looked at him steadily. I'm not going anywhere, Silas. Not because of a legal strategy, but I'm also not going to pretend the legal strategy doesn't matter, because it clearly does. He was quiet for a moment. You're a practical woman, he said. It didn't sound like a compliment exactly, and it didn't sound like an insult. It sounded like he was simply confirming a fact he'd suspected and was now certain of. "You said you wanted practical," she said. "I did," he said. "I do." They finished supper and she cleared the plates and he went out to check the animals, the way he did every evening, regardless of what the day had held. And Naomi stood at the kitchen window and watched the last of the daylight drain out of the sky over the hills, and thought about Damon Mercer's smile and the way he'd said imported, like she was a piece of furniture, and felt something firm up in her chest that hadn't been there before. She was not a piece of furniture. She was a woman who had just fixed a kitchen floor with lumber she'd cut herself, and she had a great deal more work ahead of her, and she intended to do all of it. October arrived without ceremony, and immediately got serious about being autumn. The mornings turned cold enough that her breath showed when she went out to prime the pump, and the grass in the far pasture went from brown to a dull gray gold that Silas said was normal, but that made the whole landscape look like it was bracing itself. She started getting up earlier, not because anyone told her to, but because the list of things that needed to happen before winter was long, and she'd taken inventory of it in her head, and the math was uncomfortable. She learned the wood stove completely in those first weeks of October, learned it the way you learn a difficult person, by paying close attention to its moods, by not fighting it when it was being stubborn, by understanding that certain things had to be done in a certain order or nothing worked. By the middle of the month, she could have it burning properly in the dark, by feel, in under 4 minutes. She learned to ride properly. This was harder and less dignified than she'd expected. Silas had a mare named Clara that he described as calm and forgiving, which was true in the sense that Clara did not actively try to remove her rider, but which was incomplete in that Clara also had opinions about pace and direction that she expressed through a kind of passive resistance that Naomi found maddening. Getting Clara to go where Naomi wanted her to go required a continuous negotiation that left both parties frustrated. Silas watched her from the fence one morning, with his arms folded and his expression somewhere between patient and pained. "You're fighting her," he said. "She's fighting me," Naomi said through her teeth, as Clara refused for the third time to turn left toward the gate. "She's not fighting you. She's waiting for you to decide." He came off the fence and walked over, and without asking permission, he adjusted Naomi's grip on the reins. Not roughly, just precise, 2 small corrections. "She needs to feel like you know where you're going. If you're uncertain, she's uncertain." "I know exactly where I'm going. I'm going through that gate." "Your hands don't know it." He stepped back. "Try again. Commit to it." She committed to it, and Clara, as if the previous 10 minutes had been a different conversation entirely, walked straight through the gate without hesitation. Naomi sat on the horse in the yard and felt something she didn't quite want to name, something between triumph and irritation, because the lesson had been correct, and she hadn't liked needing it. "Better," Silas said. He was almost smiling. She was starting to recognize almost smiling on him, which was itself a kind of progress. "Don't say I told you so," she said. "I wasn't going to," he said. She was fairly sure he'd been thinking it, but she let it go. She practiced every day after that. Clara remained opinionated, and Naomi remained determined, and by the end of October she could take the mare out to the east pasture and back without incident, which felt like a genuine accomplishment, because it was won. The work itself was relentless in a way that she'd understood intellectually before arriving, and now understood in her bones. She was up before dawn every day. She made the fire, she made breakfast, she packed food for whatever Silas would be doing that kept him out until midday, and then she worked on the house, patching, cleaning, organizing, working through the list she'd made in her head, until it was time to start dinner, and then she worked on dinner, and then she cleared up after dinner, and then she was tired in a way that went past tired into something that was more like her entire body simply requesting a ceasefire. She did not complain about this, not because she was performing toughness, but because she'd chosen it, and she thought there was something important about owning your choices rather than resenting them. But there were moments. There was a morning in late October when the water barrel was frozen solid, and the pump wouldn't prime, and she was standing in the yard in the dark and the cold, working at the ice with the back of an axe, and she thought, very briefly and very clearly, "What are you doing? What are you actually doing here?" She thought about Cincinnati, the small apartment that wasn't hers, the cousins' dinners where she'd felt like a tolerated inconvenience, the way she'd been invisible and known it and told herself it didn't matter. Then she cracked the ice, primed the pump, and went back inside and started the fire. She did not think about Cincinnati again that morning. Some choices you make once, and some choices you make every day, and they're both the same choice, and that's just how it is. She got the east wall properly patched in early November, with Silas's help. This required pulling the interior boards away from the frame and stuffing the cavity with horsehair and old wool before putting the boards back up. And it took most of a Saturday, and they worked in close quarters for hours. And that was the first time she really understood that Silas Mercer was a man who was deeply uncomfortable with stillness, but not with silence. He could work without talking for hours. That was fine. But if there was a pause in the work, if one of them stopped to rest for a moment, something would shift in him, a slight tension, like he wasn't sure what to do with himself without a task in his hands. She started noticing when this happened and offering something small into those pauses. Not conversation exactly, more like continuity. A question about the cattle or the land or what the winter would bring, something with a practical answer that he could give her while he was already moving again. He always answered, and sometimes the answer stretched into something more, and those were the conversations she paid the most attention to. He told her about the ranch, not the problems with it, but the history. His father had broken this ground, had built the main house with 2 other men and his wife, who'd died young. Silas had been 12 when his mother died, and he'd taken over certain chores without being asked because his father had gone somewhere unreachable for a while and someone had to. He said this without drama, as a simple sequence of events. Damon had been 7, too young to understand what was needed. Their father had compensated by protecting him from it, and Silas had compensated by doing more. And somewhere in that division they had become men who wanted entirely different things from the same piece of land. He never worked it, Silas said, pushing a board back into place and holding it while she drove the nail. Not the way it needs to be worked. He thinks the land owes him something. What does he actually want? She asked. If he got the ranch, what would he do with it? Silas was quiet for a moment. Sell it. To who? The Hallett Mining Company's been buying up land in this territory for 2 years, whole sections. He held the next board without being asked. They're not interested in cattle. They're interested in what's under the cattle. She drove the nail. There's something under this land? Possibly. The survey from 8 years ago suggested silver deposits in the eastern ridge. Nothing proven. He paused. Damon's been talking to their man in town. I know that for a fact. Naomi set the hammer down for a moment and looked at him. Does your lawyer know this? No. He should. Silas looked at her with that careful, considering expression. You think it changes the case? I think it explains why Damon is pushing now instead of waiting. If the mining company is actively acquiring land, there's a deadline. She picked the hammer back up. It also means there's more money at stake than just the ranch value. A lot more, potentially. And that means Damon is going to be more aggressive than you might expect. Silas was very still for a moment. I hadn't put it together that way, he said. Write to your lawyer this week, she said. Tell him about the mining company. He did. And the lawyer wrote back 10 days later with a letter whose tone was measurably more urgent than the previous one, which told Naomi that the lawyer had done some investigating of his own and found things that confirmed her read on the situation. She filed that away and kept working. Damon came back in mid-November. This time, he didn't arrive on horseback in the afternoon. He arrived in a buggy mid-morning, and he brought a man with him, younger, city-dressed, with the particular quality of someone who spent his time indoors and knew what that was worth. He introduced this man as a surveyor. He said he was exercising his rights as co-owner to have the property assessed. Silas was out in the east pasture. Naomi was alone in the yard when they pulled up. She stood in the yard and looked at Damon in the buggy and kept her face entirely neutral. Silas isn't here, she said. That's all right, Damon said pleasantly. We're not here to see Silas. We're here to see the property. You'll need to come back when Silas is here. Damon tilted his head. The smile was in place. Now, Mrs. Mercer, I don't think you actually have the authority to prevent a co-owner from... I have the authority to ask you to wait, she said. This is my home. Silas will be back by noon. You're welcome to wait, or you're welcome to return another day. She looked at the surveyor with the same level expression. I'll put coffee on. There was a long pause. Damon's smile flickered. Not much, just at the edges. The surveyor looked between them with the expression of a man who had been hired for a straightforward job and was now uncertain it was going to be straightforward. We'll wait, Damon said. He climbed down from the buggy, graceful as a man who always entered a room like he owned it. She put coffee on. She did not speak to Damon beyond what was necessary. She answered his questions with short, factual answers and offered nothing else. And she watched him try to engage her with the particular patience of someone who is used to finding a crack in people and prying. He didn't find one. When Silas came in at noon and saw his brother sitting at the kitchen table, the look on his face was one that Naomi read precisely. Controlled anger, deep and steady, the kind that had been managed for a long time and was getting heavier. "Get off my land," he said. "Our land," Damon said. "Get off it." Damon stood up, unhurried, and smoothed his jacket. "I'll be back with documentation, Silas. This doesn't have to be ugly." He looked at Naomi. "Thank you for the coffee, Mrs. Mercer. It was very good." He said it like a compliment that meant something else entirely. After he left, Silas stood in the kitchen for a long time with his hands on the back of a chair, and she waited, and finally he said, "I'm sorry you had to deal with that alone." "I wasn't alone," she said. "I managed." He looked up at her. "He was trying to find out how much I know," she said. "About the mining company, about the legal situation. He was watching me the whole time, seeing what I'd let slip." She started clearing the coffee cups. "I didn't let anything slip." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then, "He's going to try to use you against me." "I know." "Not because of you specifically, because that's how he operates. He finds the pressure point. Then we make sure there isn't one." She set the cups in the basin and turned to face him. "What does he think our marriage is?" Silas met her eyes. "What do you mean? Does he think it's real?" A pause. "I don't know what he thinks." "It matters," she said. "Because if he thinks it's a legal arrangement and nothing more, he'll try to drive a wedge between us. If he believes it's genuine, he'll try a different approach." She wasn't saying anything complicated. She was saying what was true. "I'm not suggesting we perform anything. I'm saying we be clear with each other so we can be consistent with the outside world." Silas looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face that she couldn't quite read. "What do you think it is?" he said. The question surprised her. She hadn't expected him to turn it back. "I think it's a partnership that's still finding its shape," she said. "I think that's honest." He nodded slowly. "That's honest," he agreed. They stood in the kitchen, and the fire was going, and the wind was coming through the patched east wall considerably less than before, and Naomi thought, yes, all right, this is what we're working with. This is what we have. It wasn't much. It also wasn't nothing. The snow came in December without warning, which Silas said was normal. What wasn't normal was how much of it arrived in the first storm. 2 feet in 36 hours, which turned the pastures into white silence and trapped them in the house for 3 days while the drifts sorted themselves out. 3 days inside with a man she was still learning. On the first day they worked separately, she on mending and he on sharpening tools, which seemed to be what he did when he needed to occupy his hands. On the second day they ran out of obvious separate tasks and ended up sitting at the kitchen table with the accounts, because the accounts needed doing, and they needed 2 people to sort the receipts from the actual records. And somewhere in the middle of that, Naomi discovered that Silas had been significantly undercharging for his cattle because he'd been working from prices that were 2 years out of date. "Where did you get these numbers?" she asked, setting down a receipt and looking at the ledger. "Delroy Hutch down at the trading post. He keeps a board." "His board is wrong." She got up and found the flyer she'd picked up in Ash Ridge 3 weeks ago from a passing livestock broker and set it next to the ledger. "The market price per head has gone up 18% since last spring. You've been selling below value." Silas looked at the numbers. Something shifted in his expression that wasn't quite embarrassment but was adjacent to it. "I don't get to market often. Delroy's the only source I've had." "Delroy is also selling to the buyers, which means he has a reason to keep the posted price low." She said it without judgment. This was simply how it worked. "You've been giving them a discount they didn't earn." He was quiet for a moment. "How much difference does it make?" She did the math on a piece of paper and showed him. The number was significant. Over 2 seasons, the difference was the kind of money that could have replaced the barn roof, the kind of money that would have bought proper lumber for the floor repairs instead of scavenged boards. Silas looked at the number for a long time without saying anything. "It's done," she said, "because there was no point in turning it into a wound. What matters is what happens from the next sale." I need to get to the Beller market in the spring, he said. Not Delroy, the actual buyers. Yes, and I should come with you. She said it plainly. I'm better at numbers than you are. That's not a criticism, it's just true. He looked up at her. You're better with the animals than I am, she said. That's also just true. Neither of us should waste time pretending otherwise. Something in his face relaxed that she hadn't realized was tight. Not relief exactly. More like a man who had been waiting for someone to simply say the plain thing instead of dancing around it. All right, he said. You come to Beller in the spring. On the third day of the storm, they talked. Not about the ranch, not about Damon, not about anything practical. They talked the way people do when they're stuck in the same space, and the work runs out, and there's nothing left but the sound of the wind, and the question of who the person across from you actually is. He told her about the winter his father had broken his leg, and 12-year-old Silas had run the ranch alone for 6 weeks. Not with pride, but matter-of-factly, the way he told most things. She told him about the year she'd taught herself to keep household accounts, because her aunt had dementia, and no one else was managing the money, and she'd been 23 and terrified and had figured it out page by page. Not with pride, either, just truth. They discovered they both disliked the taste of canned peaches. This was minor and ridiculous, and made them both almost laugh at the same time, which was the first time that had happened, and it changed something in the air between them that she couldn't have named precisely. Ticked. January brought Damon's letter. It arrived with a writer from Fallow Creek, formal and legal, and the return address had a lawyer's name on it. A different lawyer than the one Silas had consulted, one based in the capital, expensive. The letter was 3 pages of careful language that Naomi read twice before she set it down. He's filing for partition, she said. Explain it to me. He's asking a court to divide the property, formally split it between the two of you, which sounds fair on the surface, but... She turned to the second page. The way the petition describes the division would give you the main structures and the worked pastures and give him the eastern ridge. Silas went very still. Where the silver survey was, she said. Yes. And the worked land isn't worth a fraction of what the ridge is worth if there's actually silver in it. She set the letter down. This isn't a partition. It's a theft with paperwork. Silas sat down at the table. He looked like a man absorbing a blow, not dramatically, just taking it in, processing it. When do we have to respond by? 60 days. She looked at the date on the letter, which means we have until early March. I need to go to Fallow Creek. You need to go to the capital, she said. Fallow Creek's lawyer is good for local matters. This is a capital-level fight now. He looked at her. Damon knew what he was doing when he hired a capital lawyer, she said. He's had this plan for a while. This wasn't improvised. She paused. He was waiting until we were settled into winter, when travel is hardest and we have the least capacity to respond quickly. Silas's jaw tightened. He was always patient when he wanted something. Then we need to be faster than he expected us to be. She reached for paper. Write to your Fallow Creek lawyer tonight. Ask for a referral to someone in the capital with experience in property partition cases. Include everything about the mining company, the name, what you know about their acquisition activity, the silver survey, all of it. She set the pen in front of him. He looked at the pen. Then he looked at her. You're not scared, he said. It was almost a question. I'm scared, she said. I'm just not letting it run me. She nodded at the paper. Write the letter. He wrote the letter. She sealed it herself and gave it to the writer in the morning with enough money for fast transit, and she stood in the yard and watched the writer go and felt the cold working through her coat and thought about a smooth-faced man in a good buggy and the specific quality of his smile and what it was covering underneath. He thought this was going to be easy. He thought she was furniture. She went back inside and added 3 things to the list she kept in her head, the list of what needed doing and in what order. And then she started on breakfast because the morning wasn't going to wait for any of it. Outside, the wind was picking up again, coming off the eastern ridge, cold and insistent and indifferent to everything below it. The ridge that Damon wanted, the ridge that held whatever was underneath it. Naomi Cross set a pan on the stove and listened to the wind and thought, not if I have anything to say about it. She had quite a lot to say. The letter to Fallow Creek went out on a Monday, and by Wednesday, Naomi had already moved on to the next problem, because that was the only way she knew how to operate. You did what you could do today, and you didn't stand around waiting for the world to respond. The capital lawyer situation would take weeks to resolve. The partition petition had 60 days on it. Neither of those things could be rushed by worrying at them, so she put them in a compartment in the back of her mind, the way she'd learned to do with problems that needed time rather than immediate action, and she focused on what was in front of her. What was in front of her in January was livestock. Silas had 31 head of cattle and 4 horses in a situation with the feed supply that was more precarious than he'd acknowledged when she first arrived, mostly because he'd been managing it alone for 3 years and had developed a tolerance for precariousness that she was still calibrating to. She discovered the real state of the hay stores on a Tuesday morning when she went into the barn to look for a particular tool and stopped to actually count the bales instead of just noting that there were some. She went back to the house and stood in the kitchen doorway. "How many head do you need to carry through to spring?" she asked. Silas was at the table with coffee. He looked up. Something in her expression told him this was a real question. "All of them, ideally. Lose a few every winter. Try to keep it under 5. "How much hay do you need for 31 head through March?" He was quiet for a moment. She could see him doing the math. "How much do we have?" he said. "I counted this morning. You're short. Not critically, if the winter ends early. But if we get another storm like December's, or if March runs cold—" "I know," he said. He put his coffee down. "I've been rationing since November." "How much are you rationing?" "About 20% under what I'd prefer." She came in and sat down. "The cattle are going to start showing it in the next few weeks if we don't supplement. You'll lose more than 5. There's no hay to buy in winter, not out here." "Delroy at the trading post," she said. "Delroy marks up 40% in winter." "I know, we still need to talk to him." Silas's jaw tightened in the particular way it did when he was being asked to spend money he didn't have on something he resented needing. She'd seen that expression enough times to recognize it, and she'd learned that pushing directly at it only made it worse. So she waited. "How short are we?" he said finally. 6 weeks of full rations, maybe 7. If March is warm, we're fine. If it isn't, it usually isn't. Then we need to talk to Delroy." He went to Delroy. He came back with 2 wagon loads of hay at a price that made his expression look like he'd bitten something sour. And he didn't complain about it to her, but he was quieter than usual for 2 days afterward, and she understood that this was a man absorbing the compounded weight of 3 years of managing alone, of not having someone to catch the things he missed. She didn't say that to him. She just made sure supper was hot and let him be quiet. What she did instead, that week, was sit down with every financial record she could find in the house and build a proper picture of where they were. Not just the accounts she and Silas had sorted during the storm, but everything: the tax records, the sale receipts, the costs of equipment, the costs of feed over the previous 3 winters. She found receipts stuffed in a tin box on a shelf in the back room, most of them unsorted, some of them going back to when Silas's father was still alive. She sorted them all. It took 4 evenings and left her with ink on her fingers and a clear, unpleasant picture of a ranch that had been treading water for years, always one bad winter or one bad sale from going under, held up primarily by Silas's stubbornness and his willingness to work hours that would have broken most men. She also found something else. Tucked in the back of the tin box, behind 3 years of receipts, was a folded piece of paper that looked different from the rest. Thicker, more deliberate. She unfolded it carefully. It was a letter from a man named William Hallett, the Hallett Mining Company, dated 14 months ago, addressed to Silas Mercer and Damon Mercer jointly. The letter made an offer on the Eastern Ridge, a specific, detailed offer, with a price that was, she had to read it twice, substantial, more than the annual cattle revenue for several years combined. Silas had never mentioned this letter. She sat with it for a long time. Then she brought it to him the next morning and set it on the table without preamble. He looked at it. His expression didn't change much, which was its own kind of answer. "You knew about this," she said. "Yes." "You didn't mention it to me, or to your lawyer." "No." She sat down across from him. "Why?" He was quiet for long enough that she knew he was deciding how much to tell her, which itself told her something, that there was more to tell than the simple existence of an offer. "If I show that letter to a lawyer," he said slowly, "it establishes that the ridge has significant value, which helps Damon's partition case. It makes the argument that the partition is unequal more visible." She thought about that. But the letter is addressed to both of you, jointly, which means Hallett approached you as co-owners, which means Hallett may be aware of the joint ownership structure. Yes. Which means if Damon is working with Hallett, if this partition is designed to give Damon the ridge so he can sell to Hallett, there may be a coordination agreement between them that could constitute fraud. She looked at him steadily. Do you understand what I'm saying? Silas was very still. If Damon made a private arrangement with Hallett before filing the partition petition, she said, that changes what this is. That's not a family dispute over property. That's a conspiracy to defraud a co-owner of his share of a mineral rights sale. She tapped the letter. This letter isn't a liability. This letter is potential evidence. She could see him processing it, the same way he processed most things. Not quickly, but thoroughly, turning it over and looking at all the sides. The capital lawyer, he said. Yes, this goes to the capital lawyer. With everything else. He picked the letter up and looked at it for a moment. Then he set it down again. I was trying to protect the ranch, he said. I thought if Hallett's offer was in play, it would make the partition look more attractive to a court. Give them a reason to approve it. I understand why you thought that, she said. You were wrong, but I understand it. He looked at her. There was something in his expression that wasn't quite what she'd call vulnerable. Silas Mercer wasn't a man who did vulnerable easily, but was in that direction. I should have told you, he said. Yes, she said. You should have. We're partners, Silas. That means I need to know what we're actually dealing with. I know. No more keeping things back to protect me. I don't need protecting. I need information. He held her gaze. All right, he said. All right. She added the Hallett letter to the package they were sending to the capital. With a cover note, she wrote herself explaining the timeline and the implication. 3 days later, when the writer came through again, it all went south together, and there was nothing to do but wait. February was the month Naomi learned that the town of Ash Ridge had a longer memory than she'd given it credit for. She had to go in for supplies. Silas was down with a chest cold that she refused to let him work through, partly because he genuinely needed rest, and partly because she'd seen what happened when men like him decided they were fine when they weren't, and it invariably made things worse. He fought her on it for a day, and then his body resolved the argument by making it impossible for him to stand up for more than 10 minutes without coughing. She took Clara into town alone. The trading post was run by a woman named Mabel Hutch, Delroy's wife, who had the particular manner of a person who had cataloged everything she'd ever observed about everyone she knew and kept it organized for future reference. Mabel had been pleasant enough on Naomi's previous visits, in the way that frontier women were often pleasant to each other because frontier life was hard enough without adding unnecessary friction. But today there was something different in the way Mabel greeted her. A slight reservation, a quality of watching. Naomi got what she came for and paid for it, and was loading the supplies into the wagon when she heard 2 women talking near the side of the building. She wasn't trying to listen. She simply had good hearing, and the wind was coming the right direction. Always wondered what Silas was thinking, sending off for someone like that. Damon says the marriage was never proper to begin with. Says Silas only did it for the legal standing. Naomi kept loading supplies. Her hands were steady. Her face was neutral. She had learned in Cincinnati that the most important thing, when you heard people talking about you, was not to give them the additional story of watching you react. She drove home without hurrying. Silas was up when she got back, sitting by the fire wrapped in a blanket, which meant his fever had come down enough for his stubbornness to reassert itself. She told him about what she'd heard. She told him plainly, without editorializing. He was quiet for a long moment. Damon's been in town, he said. Obviously. He knows people. He's always been... He stopped, coughed. He knows how to talk to people. He makes things sound reasonable. What is he saying specifically? Do you know? I can guess. Silas looked at the fire. He'll be saying the marriage was a legal maneuver, that I brought you out here for the court case, not genuinely, that you're... He stopped again. That I'm what? That you're being used, and that you probably know it and don't care because you had nowhere else to go. He said it without looking at her, which she understood as a form of consideration. He wasn't sure how she'd take it, and he was giving her the option to respond without being watched. She sat down. And the people in town, do they believe him? Some will, some won't. Damon's charming, and people like charming, but they also know him. They know what he is. He paused. But enough will believe enough of it to make things uncomfortable. She thought about the women by the trading post, the quality of Mabel's watching. It's already uncomfortable, she said. Silas looked at her then. I'm sorry, he said. This isn't what you came here for. No, she agreed. But it's what's here, so we deal with it. She made him go back to bed, and she sat in the kitchen and thought about Damon Mercer and his smooth, patient strategy, and felt, not for the first time, a cold clarity that she associated with moments when she understood precisely what she was up against. He was trying to isolate them. From the community, from potential allies, from the basic social trust that made frontier life possible. A ranch this remote couldn't function in complete isolation. You needed neighbors when things went wrong. You needed the trading post. You needed the goodwill of the people who made up the fabric of a place. Damon knew that. He was pulling at those threads carefully, one by one. She would have to start pulling back. She just needed to figure out how. The opportunity came in a way she hadn't planned for, which was true of most opportunities. In early March, before the snow had fully finished with the season, a neighbor named Ruth Alderman came to the ranch with a problem. Ruth was a widow, 50-some years old, with a small claim 6 miles north that she'd been working with her son until the son broke his arm in November and hadn't healed right. She came to the door looking like a woman who had spent weeks deciding whether to ask for help and had finally run out of other options. Silas was fully recovered by then and out on the far pasture. Naomi answered the door. Ruth said carefully that she was having trouble with her plow harness, that she had fields that needed turning, that she'd heard Naomi was practical. She said the word with a slight hesitation that told Naomi someone had used it as a descriptor, probably not charitably, and Ruth was now repurposing it as a genuine assessment. Come in, Naomi said. Tell me what the harness is doing. Ruth came in. She sat at the kitchen table and described the problem. A buckle mechanism that had cracked, a replacement she couldn't get to fit right, a configuration issue she couldn't work out with one hand because her son's good hand was the one he couldn't use. Naomi made tea and looked at the broken buckle Ruth had brought with her. It wasn't complicated. It was just a matter of having the right eye for how the pieces fit. She explained it in plain terms, drew it out on a piece of paper, and then said she had a similar buckle in the tack box that Ruth was welcome to take if the dimensions matched. They matched. Ruth sat at the kitchen table with her tea going cold and looked at Naomi with an expression that was reassessing something. People in town are saying things, Ruth said. Not gently, just directly, in the way of a woman who'd been on the frontier long enough to prefer plain. I know, Naomi said. Damon Mercer's been talking. I know that too. Ruth was quiet for a moment. I knew their father, good man, wore himself thin trying to be fair to both of them. She turned her teacup in her hands. Damon was always the one who felt owed, even as a boy. What's he saying specifically? Naomi asked. Not what I assume, what you've actually heard. Ruth looked at her. Then she told her, directly and completely, the way Naomi had asked. The claim that the marriage was manufactured for legal purposes. The suggestion that Naomi had no real standing as a wife, that she was essentially a hired arrangement, that Silas had imported her as a chess piece. There was also, and this part Ruth hesitated before saying, a suggestion that Naomi's presence on the ranch was itself somehow irregular, that Silas hadn't filed the proper paperwork, that the marriage certificate might not be in order. Naomi set her teacup down. The marriage certificate is filed with the county clerk in Fallow Creek. It has been since October. I filed it myself. She held Ruth's gaze. If Damon is implying otherwise, he's either uninformed or lying. Ruth held her gaze back. Which do you think it is? Lying, Naomi said. He's not an uninformed man. Ruth nodded slowly. She picked up the buckle. She turned it over in her hands. My son's going to need help with the field work this spring, she said. I was thinking I might mention to some people that you and Silas, handle a harness buckle problem better than the trading post did. She looked up. If that's all right with you. Naomi understood exactly what was being offered. That would be fine, she said. Ruth left with the buckle and an expression that had traveled a considerable distance from the one she'd arrived with. Naomi watched her go and then went back inside and stood in the kitchen for a moment. You didn't fight rumor with denial. She'd learned that in Cincinnati, where denial only kept the story alive. You fought rumor with presence, with being known, with being the person people called when something needed fixing, the person who showed up and did the thing without making it complicated. She had work to do. March arrived cold and windy and bringing everything at once. The Capitol lawyer's first letter came. His name was Aldous Crane, and his letter was 7 pages of dense, precise language that Naomi read 3 times to be sure she understood every implication. The summary was, they had a case. The Hallett letter was significant. If coordination between Damon and Hallett could be the unequal distribution of value, but on grounds of fraudulent intent. Crane needed documentation of any contact between Damon and Hallett, dates, witnesses, anything concrete. He also said something else on the last page that Naomi read carefully. He recommended, if it could be arranged, that they consolidate their credibility in the community before the partition hearing, which would likely be scheduled for late spring. A court in this territory, he said, paid attention to standing, to how a family was regarded, to whether they were rooted. She showed the letter to Silas. They read it together at the kitchen table, which had become the place where the important conversations happened, as though the table itself had assumed that function. He wants us to be visible, Silas said. Yes. He was quiet. Silas Mercer was not a man who sought visibility. He was a man who got up early and worked hard and came home and did it again, and the idea of performing anything for an audience was visibly uncomfortable to him. It doesn't have to be performed, she said, reading his expression. It just has to be real. We go to town when there's reason to go. We help neighbors when they need help. We're present. You've already been doing that, he said. I was looking at her with something she was starting to recognize as the particular quality of attention he gave when he was revising his understanding of something. Ruth Alderman came in February, she said. I helped with a harness buckle. I think she's mentioned it to people. She has. He was quiet for a moment. Hector Moss mentioned it to me last week. Said he heard Silas Mercer's wife was good with tack. He paused. I didn't say anything. I didn't know what she'd told him. The truth, probably, Naomi said. I just fixed a buckle. That's not nothing out here. She knew that. She'd known it since the day she arrived and understood that the frontier valued competence the way other places valued beauty or birth, as the fundamental currency of worth. We need to know who's seen Damon with Hallett's man, she said, steering them back. Crane needs witnesses. Specific, willing witnesses. Delroy at the trading post might know. He sees everything. Silas looked less than thrilled about this. Delroy talks to everyone. Which is exactly why we should talk to him. Silas went to Delroy that week. He came back with 2 names. Men who had independently seen Damon meeting with a representative of the Hallett Mining Company in Fallow Creek on 2 separate occasions, both predating the partition petition by several months. Neither man had thought much of it at the time. Both were willing to say what they'd seen. The information went to Crane in the Capitol. He wrote back 10 days later, shorter this time, and his tone had shifted from careful to something closer to confident. They were building something. It didn't feel like it day to day. It felt like correspondence and waiting and managing the ranch and trying to stay ahead of the next problem. But it was accumulating in the background like the months of work on the house, each small thing adding to something that was becoming solid. The accident happened on a Tuesday in late March, which was a day that had looked when it started like any other day. The snow had thinned enough in the lower pastures that Naomi had been riding Clara out every few days, building the habit, getting more comfortable. Silas had suggested, carefully, that she try the East Trail if she felt ready. It was a longer route, but flatter in the parts that mattered, and it would let her see the full extent of the eastern pasture before the spring work began. She felt ready. Clara was in a cooperative mood which Naomi had learned to appreciate without trusting entirely. They went out mid-morning when the light was good and the ground was visible. The East Trail ran along a low ridge, not the eastern ridge of the Silver Survey, just a modest natural rise that gave a view of the pasture below. She was on the way back thinking about what she'd seen in the pasture, one section of fence line that needed attention before they moved the cattle in the spring, when Clara shied. She didn't see what caused it. A sound maybe, something in the scrub to the left. Clara went sideways with a speed that was startling in an animal she'd come to think of as deliberate, and Naomi, who was a passable rider but not an experienced one, was not ready for it. She lost the left stirrup first. Then the reins pulled through her hands at the wrong angle, and there was a moment, a split second, where she might have recovered, where another rider with another year of experience might have stayed on. She didn't stay on. She went off Clara's right side, and the ground came up fast, and she landed on her left side, on hard-packed earth, with a force that knocked the air completely out of her body and sent a pain through her left leg that was unlike anything she had experienced in her adult life. Sharp and total, and immediately nauseating. She lay there for a moment, unable to breathe, staring at the sky. Clara stood 6 feet away and looked at her with what seemed, in Naomi's current condition, like reproach. The first breath came back in a ragged gasp. She lay still and did an inventory, the way you did when something had gone wrong and you needed to understand how wrong before you tried to move. Her left leg was the problem. The pain was specific, below the knee, radiating upward. She tried moving her foot and the pain spiked hard enough that she stopped immediately. She was 6 miles from the ranch. She was alone. Her horse was standing nearby but showed no signs of coming to her, which was not Clara's fault exactly, but was extremely inconvenient. She sat up. This was difficult and took longer than she wanted it to. She looked at her leg. Her skirt had torn along the left side when she fell, and she could see through it that her lower leg was already swelling in a way that confirmed what the pain had already told her. "All right," she said to herself, or to Clara, or simply to the air. "All right." She could not ride back. She knew that immediately and without sentimentality. Getting back on Clara with this leg, alone, was not possible. The only question was whether she could get Clara to stay near her long enough for someone to realize she hadn't come back, or whether she could find a way to make enough noise to be heard, or whether she could do something with the leg itself before the cold got into it. She pulled herself to a sitting position against a nearby rock. The movement made the world go gray at the edges for a moment, and she breathed through it until it steadied. Clara had drifted a few feet, but hadn't bolted, which was something. She had her coat. She had a small knife she'd taken to carrying in the coat pocket after the second week on the ranch, when Silas had mentioned casually that it was a good idea. She did not have water. She did not have anything she could use as a splint except... She looked at the scrub around her. There were branches. Dry, but that was fine. She needed rigid, not flexible. She was not going to sit here and wait to be found. She got 2 branches, the straightest she could reach without moving the leg, and she took off her coat and then thought about that and put the coat back on because the cold was real, and she needed to not compound the problem with hypothermia. She removed her outer skirt instead, the heavy wool one, the layer she'd been glad of all winter, and she cut it into strips with the knife, working methodically, keeping her hand steady by focusing on the mechanics of the task. She had the branches positioned and was beginning to tie the first strip when she heard hoofbeats. Silas came around the bend of the trail at a pace that told her he'd been looking, that something had told him to come looking. Clara, probably, or the absence of Naomi by midday, or that particular instinct of people who've been responsible for land long enough to feel when something is wrong. He pulled up and was off his horse before it had fully stopped, and he came to her fast, but he didn't panic, which she was grateful for because panic would have made it worse. He took in the situation in about 3 seconds. Her position against the rock, the branches, the strips of skirt, the leg. And he said, "How bad?" "Below the knee. I think it's broken. I was trying to splint it." He crouched down and looked at the leg with the same attention he gave everything. "You have to stay still," he said. "Moving, it's going to make it worse." "I know. I was trying not to move it." She paused. "I wasn't going to just sit here." He looked at her then, a quick, sharp look, and she could see him taking in the cut strips of skirt, the positioned branches, the fact that she'd been systematically solving the problem alone in the cold with a broken leg, and something moved across his face that she didn't have a name for. "I know you weren't," he said quietly. He needed to splint it before he could move her. She understood this, and he understood this, and neither of them made it into a bigger conversation than it was. The problem was that her skirt, what was left of it, was too damaged to work with effectively, and his coat was heavy canvas that wouldn't cut easily into strips, and they needed more material than they had. He looked at the options for a moment. "I'm going to have to use your dress," he said. He said it plainly and without looking away, because he was not a man who dissembled about necessary things. "I know," she said. "I need to get to the lower part, the hem and below." "Do what you need to do," she said. He cut away the lower portion of her dress. Careful, focused, not lingering, his jaw set with the concentration of someone doing a medical task, and treating it as exactly that. He worked quickly. She had her coat and her dignity and a broken leg, and she kept her breathing steady and watched his hands and was aware, in a distant and somewhat abstract way, that this was an intimate thing regardless of how clinically they were both treating it. He had her leg splinted in under 10 minutes. The pain when he positioned the bone was something she absorbed by pressing her back against the rock and breathing through her nose and not making a sound, because making a sound wouldn't have helped anything. "I'm going to carry you to the horse," he said. "It's going to hurt." "I know. Tell me if it's too much." "It won't be too much," she said. "I'm not going to lie here in the cold." He carried her. He was a strong man, and she was not a small woman, and he carried her without complaint and with more care than she'd expected, which she noted and filed away. Getting her onto the horse was harder, and took both of them working at it, and the pain at one particular moment was bad enough that she said, with some feeling, a word she normally didn't use, and Silas said nothing about this, but there was something in his face that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite relief. They rode back slowly, him behind her on his horse, his arms around her holding the reins, her legs splinted out in front of her, and it took a very long time, and the cold pressed in on both sides, and she was exhausted and in pain and more shaken than she wanted to admit. At some point during the ride, without deciding to, she leaned back against him. Not dramatically, just let the tiredness make that small concession. His arms stayed steady around her without comment or adjustment, which was exactly right, and she closed her eyes for part of the ride and let the horse carry them both. She didn't learn until 3 days later what Damon had done with it. She was in bed. The doctor from Fallow Creek had come and confirmed the break and set it properly and told her she was fortunate it was a clean fracture, and she was spending her enforced stillness in a state of profound irritation at her own helplessness. When Ruth Alderman came to visit and sat down with the particular expression of a woman who had something to say and was working out how to say it. "There's a story going around town," Ruth said. Naomi looked at her. "Tell me." "Damon Mercer has been telling people that Silas tore your dress off on the East Trail." Ruth said it flatly, without performance. "He's saying it was not an accident. He's saying there was a conflict. That Silas—" She stopped. "That Silas what?" "That he hurt you," Ruth said, "and that the broken leg wasn't from a fall." The room was very quiet for a moment. Naomi lay there with her splinted leg elevated and the afternoon light coming through the bedroom window, and thought about Damon Mercer's smooth face and his careful smile and the particular patience of a man who had been waiting for an opening and had finally found one. He'd taken a rescue and made it a crime. He'd taken a man carrying his injured wife home and made it something else entirely. "How many people has he told?" she asked. "Enough," Ruth said. "There's talk of a community meeting. Some people are saying they think Silas should be made to answer for it." Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, not because she was afraid, because she needed a second to see the whole shape of what was happening before she decided what to do about it. A public meeting. Accusations. The kind of story that traveled fast in a small community and left stains even after you'd scrubbed them out. She opened her eyes. "When is this meeting?" she said. "Saturday." "Help me figure out how to get there on a crutch," she said. Ruth looked at her. "The doctor said—" "I know what the doctor said. Help me figure it out anyway." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There's a crutch in my barn that my husband used. I'll bring it tomorrow." "Thank you," Naomi said. She lay back and stared at the ceiling and thought about Saturday and what she would say when she got there, because she was going to need to say it right. She was going to need to say it in a way that cut through 3 months of accumulated whisper and manipulation and exposed the whole thing for what it was. She had until Saturday. It was enough time. Ruth brought the crutch on Thursday morning, as promised, and Naomi spent 2 days learning to use it. This was less straightforward than she'd anticipated. The crutch was sized for a man. Ruth's late husband had been tall, and it sat too high under her arm, which meant she had to adjust her posture in a way that created a different kind of pain in her shoulder and back on top of the existing pain in her leg. She practiced in the kitchen first, then in the yard, then on the uneven ground between the house and the barn, because if she was going to walk into a community meeting on a crutch, she was not going to do it stumbling. Silas watched her practice from the barn doorway on Thursday afternoon without saying anything, which she had come to understand as his version of support. On Friday morning, he said, "You don't have to go." "I know," she said. I can go. I can speak for both of us. She looked at him. He was leaning against the kitchen doorframe with his coffee, and she could see that he'd been thinking about this for days, turning it over, trying to find the version of it where she didn't have to walk into a room full of people on a crutch and defend herself against something that had never happened. If you go alone, she said carefully, they'll spend the whole meeting wondering why I'm not there, whether I'm hiding, whether the story is true. She set the crutch against the table and lowered herself into a chair. I'm the only one who can answer what Damon is saying because I'm the one it happened to, or rather, didn't happen to. People might not believe you. Some won't, she said, but some will. And right now, some is better than none, which is what we have. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his coffee. I don't like it, he said. I know you don't. If someone in that room says something, then I'll handle it, she said. Silas, look at me. He looked at her. I have been handling things since before I got on that train in Cincinnati. I handled the platform and the stove and the floor and the water barrel and Damon in the kitchen in 6 weeks of frontier winter. She held his gaze. I can handle a meeting. He held her gaze for a long moment. All right, he said. It came out quieter than she'd expected. Not resigned, more like a man acknowledging something. What I need from you on Saturday, she said, is to let me speak when I need to speak and not try to step in front of it. I know that's going to be hard. It's going to be very hard, he said. I know, do it anyway. He almost smiled, that almost smile that she'd learned to read. Saturday came with gray sky and cold that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to turn into weather. They drove to town in the wagon, Naomi's leg elevated on a folded blanket, and the ride was long enough and quiet enough that she had time to settle into herself the way she needed to before walking into a room full of people. She had spent Thursday and Friday thinking through what she was going to say. Not rehearsing it, she didn't work like that, couldn't hold a prepared speech in her head without it going stiff and unconvincing, but understanding the structure of what needed to happen. She needed the room to follow a sequence of logic. She needed them to arrive somewhere on their own, not be dragged there. The meeting was held in the grain merchant's warehouse on the main street of Ash Ridge, the largest interior space in town, which said something about either the importance of the meeting or the enthusiasm with which gossip had spread. There were already 30 or 40 people inside when they arrived, and Naomi was aware, as she came through the door on her crutch, of the particular quality of silence that falls over a crowd when the subject of their conversation appears in person. She did not look at the floor. She did not move fast. She moved at exactly the pace the crutch allowed her, and she looked at the room with an expression that was not defiant, and not apologetic, and not afraid. Just present, just the face of a woman who had come to a meeting because she had something to say. She saw Damon immediately. He was standing near the front with a small cluster of men she didn't know well, and his expression when he saw her was interesting. A very fast sequence of things, surprise and then recalculation, and then the smile reasserting itself over both. He hadn't expected her to come. She'd counted on that. Mabel Hutch was there. Several of the men from the platform, the day she arrived. Ruth Alderman, near the side wall, who gave her a small nod. A man she recognized as the local magistrate, older, heavy-set, with the look of someone who had seen enough community disputes to be tired of them. The magistrate opened it. He said there had been concerns raised about the welfare of a resident, and that the community had a right to address those concerns. And he said it in the careful language of a man who was trying to be fair to all parties without having formed an opinion yet. Then he asked Damon to say what he'd said. Damon said it. He said it well. She had to give him that. He was smooth and measured, and he spoke with the tone of a man who was reluctant to raise an ugly thing, but felt he had no choice. He said that on the day of Naomi's accident, multiple people had seen Silas returning with his wife in a condition of significant distress. He said the dress had been, his word was destroyed. He said that the explanation offered, a riding accident, a splint improvised on the trail, strained credulity. He said he was not making an accusation. He said he was only asking the community to consider whether someone should be checking on Mrs. Mercer's well-being. He said it all with an expression of pained concern that Naomi studied carefully from across the room. He was good. He had practiced this too. The magistrate asked if anyone could speak to what they'd seen. 2 men said they had seen Silas come into town the following Monday with a certain manner about him that suggested guilt, Though when the magistrate pressed them on what specifically they meant by manner, neither of them could be precise. A woman said she'd heard Naomi screaming on the trail, though she lived 4 miles from the East Trail, and the geography of this claim made no sense, and the magistrate pointed that out mildly. Then the magistrate asked if Silas wanted to speak. Silas stood up. He said plainly and in few words that his wife's horse had shied, and she'd fallen and broken her leg, and he'd ridden out to find her and splinted the break on the trail before bringing her home, and that cutting her dress had been necessary for the splint. He said there was nothing more to it than that. He sat down. He had done exactly what Naomi asked, said what was true and no more, without heat, without addressing Damon directly. The room was not satisfied. She could feel it. A simple denial, however calm, was still just a denial. The magistrate looked at her. "Mrs. Mercer, do you want to speak?" She stood up. Getting vertical from a seated position with a crutch and a broken leg was not elegant, and she didn't try to make it elegant. She took her time and did it correctly, and stood there with her weight on the crutch and looked at the room. She let the silence run for a few seconds before she spoke. "I want to tell you what actually happened," she said. "Not to argue with anything that's been said. Just to tell you plainly what occurred." Her voice was even. Not loud. The warehouse had decent acoustics and she didn't need to project. She spoke at conversation volume, and the room went quiet to hear her. She told them about the ride. She told them about Clara shying and the fall and landing wrong, and the immediate understanding that the leg was broken. She told them specifically about what she had done before Silas arrived, about cutting her own skirt into strips, about finding branches for a splint, about the process of trying to solve the problem she was in. "I was building the splint myself," she said. "When Silas found me, I had one strip already tied. He finished it." She paused. "The dress, what remained of it, was insufficient for the job. The material was too weak and there wasn't enough of it. Silas cut the lower portion of my dress because we needed more fabric for the ties." She looked at the room, moving her gaze steadily across it, not avoiding the skeptical faces. "It was a medical decision made in a cold field with a woman who had a broken bone. There was nothing else to it." She stopped and let that sit. "Now," she said, shifting slightly on the crutch, "I want to ask a question." The room waited. "How many people in this room have had occasion to help someone who was injured on the trail?" A few hands went up. She nodded at them. "And how many of you have used whatever material was available, a shirt, a coat, whatever you had, to deal with the situation?" The same hands, and a few more. "That's what happened," she said. "That's all that happened." She could see the room shifting. Not completely. There were still faces that were reserved, waiting, but the direction of it had changed. She kept going. "I also want to say something about the source of the story you've been hearing." She turned and looked directly at Damon for the first time. He met her eyes with the smile still in place. Damon Mercer has an interest in this community's opinion of his brother's household. That interest is not personal concern. It's financial. She heard the room stir. She continued. "Damon has filed a legal petition to partition the Mercer family ranch. The particular division he's proposed would give him ownership of the Eastern Ridge, the section with a surveyed mineral deposit. He has been meeting, over the past year, with a representative of the Hallett Mining Company, which has been purchasing land in this territory. Those meetings predated the partition petition by several months." The stir in the room got louder. Damon stood up. "This is not relevant to—" "It is relevant," she said, without raising her voice, "because this community deserves to understand why you've been spending 3 months telling people that my husband is dangerous. It's not because you're concerned about me. It's because a court hearing is scheduled for this spring, and a man whose wife is publicly vouching for his character is harder to dispossess than a man whose community has turned against him." Dead silence. She looked at Damon. "I'm not a fragile woman, Mr. Mercer. I know you'd prefer I were. I know the story works better if I'm someone who needs rescuing from her own husband." She kept her voice even. "I'm not. I'm a woman who broke her leg on the East Trail and fixed her own splint while waiting to be found, and my husband brought me home, and that's the whole of it." She sat down. The magistrate cleared his throat. "Mr. Mercer, do you want to respond to what's been said?" Damon stood up, and now the smile was doing something different. It was still there, but it was tighter, and underneath it there was something that she had not seen on his face before, which was the expression of a man who had miscalculated. The question of the partition case is a separate matter entirely, he said. I raised concerns about my sister-in-law's well-being in good faith. What is the Hallett Mining Company's offer on the Eastern Ridge? A man from the back called out. Damon turned toward the voice. I don't see what that... Is it true you met with their man in Fallow Creek? Another voice. One of the men Silas had identified as a potential witness. I have business contacts in Fallow Creek, yes. That's not... Before or after you filed the partition papers? The same man. Damon's smile was working hard now. These are matters for a court, not a community meeting. I'm not on trial here. Nobody's on trial, the magistrate said. He was looking at Damon with a different quality of attention than he'd worn at the start of the meeting. But when someone raises community concerns, the community gets to ask questions. My concern was and remains. Your concern, said Ruth Alderman from the side wall, in the quiet voice of a woman who did not speak often in public, and therefore was heard completely when she did, seems to have arrived very conveniently, right after you filed papers on the ranch. The room was very quiet. Damon looked at Ruth. He looked at the magistrate. He looked at the faces around him, and Naomi watched him perform a rapid internal calculation about what he could salvage and what was already gone. I came here in good faith, he said. His voice had changed. The pleasant surface of it had thinned enough that something harder was audible underneath. My brother's management of that ranch has been questionable for years. My father's will was ambiguous, and the courts will sort it out. Whatever my sister-in-law wants to claim about my motives is her business. The mining company, someone said again. What's the offer? Damon turned toward the voice with something that was no longer even trying to be a smile. That is none of your concern, he said. And there it was, the flatness, the coldness, the voice of a man who had been performing patience for months and had now spent his supply of it. This is a family matter, a legal matter, and I don't need to answer to a warehouse full of... He stopped himself. But the pause was not fast enough. The room heard what he had not finished saying. The magistrate stood up. I think we've heard what we need to hear, he said. He looked at Damon with the expression of a man who had finally formed an opinion. Mrs. Mercer, thank you for coming in. He looked at Silas. Silas, I don't think there's anything more to address here. Silas stood. He didn't say anything. He came to where Naomi was seated and offered his hand to help her up, and she took it, and they moved toward the door, and the room parted for them in a way that rooms part when the weight of opinion has shifted and everyone can feel it. At the door, Naomi paused and looked back. Damon was standing near the front of the room, and the men who had been clustered around him when she arrived had drifted several feet away, the way people drift from a thing that has revealed itself to be what they suspected but hadn't wanted to say. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not calculation, not pleasantry, not the managed surface of a man working a strategy. Just the bare face of someone who had wanted something for a very long time and had just watched it get further away. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she turned and went through the door. Outside the air was cold and sharp, and she stood on the step and breathed it. Silas was beside her. He said nothing for a moment, and she was grateful because she needed a moment to let her legs stop shaking, which they had started doing somewhere in the middle of her speaking and had not stopped. She hadn't shown it, but it was there. Your hands were shaking when you stood up, he said quietly. She looked at him. You could see that? I was watching. I didn't show it. No, he agreed. You didn't. Ruth came out behind them and put a hand briefly on Naomi's arm without saying anything, which was exactly right. Hector Moss, the man who had spoken up about the mining meetings, came out and shook Silas's hand and said simply, "Good luck with the court case." And Silas said thank you. The ride home was different from the ride in. She didn't analyze it. It was just different. A quality of quiet that wasn't the weighted silence of dread, but something lighter. She watched the landscape go past and felt the exhaustion settling into her properly now that there was nothing left to hold herself rigid for. You said I had to let you speak, Silas said. They were halfway home. You did, she said. It was... He paused, looking for the word. It was hard to watch you carry that. I know. Not because I thought you couldn't. I know that too, she said. He was quiet for a bit. Then, the thing about the partition, the mining company, you laid it out in front of the whole room, Yes. Damon's going to know that you understand exactly what he's doing. He already knew, she said. He knew the minute I didn't give anything away when he came to the kitchen. He's known for a while that I'm not. She thought about the word he'd used in that first meeting, imported. He's known for a while that I'm not what he expected. What did he expect? She considered this. Someone embarrassed to be there. Someone who could be made to feel that she didn't belong. Someone who would make things easier for him by being uncertain about her own place here. She watched a hawk moving on a thermal above the east pasture. He's been working with that assumption since day one. It's why all his moves have been aimed at the wrong target. Silas looked over at her. He's been trying to make me feel like a liability to you, she said. But I'm not a liability. I'm the opposite. She said it without vanity, just as a fact. He took too long to understand that. Silas was quiet for a moment. What do we do now? Now we let Crane do his job, she said. The witnesses, the Hallett letter, the timeline, that's what the court case needs. Today was about the community. The court is a different conversation. She shifted her leg on the blanket. We go home. We finish the spring work. We let the law move. And Damon? She thought about his face at the door, the bare expression underneath the calculation. Damon is going to do something impulsive, she said. He's been patient for a long time, and today cost him something he didn't plan to lose. When patient people run out of patience, they make mistakes. What kind of mistakes? I don't know yet, but when he makes one, we need to be ready to document it. She looked at Silas. Don't engage with him directly. Don't fight with him. If he contacts you, write it down. The date, what he said, everything. Give it to Crane. Silas nodded. He understood the logic. I was a man who preferred direct action. She knew that about him, and the instruction to document and wait went against his grain, but he understood why. They got home in the late afternoon, and she went inside and sat down in the kitchen chair and let herself be tired properly for the first time since the accident. Her leg ached. Her shoulder from the crutch ached. She was, she realized, deeply and completely worn through. Silas made supper. He was not a skilled cook. She had taken that on early, and it had simply become hers. But he could manage beans and salt pork and cornbread when required. And he managed it now without being asked, and she sat at the table and ate what he put in front of her, and did not make a single comment about the cornbread, which was somewhat dense. It's heavy, he said, as if reading her thoughts. It's fine, she said. It's heavy, he said again. I know it is. The next time start the leavening earlier, she said, and he almost laughed, and she almost laughed, and it broke something open in the evening that had been closed tight all day. Damon's mistake came 11 days later. Naomi had predicted it, and she had been right about the shape of it, which gave her no particular satisfaction because the form it took was uglier than she'd anticipated. He went to Crane directly. Not through a lawyer, not through the court. He rode to the Capitol and presented himself at Crane's office and told Crane that he was prepared to offer a settlement. He would drop the partition petition in exchange for a cash payment representing what he called his fair share of the mineral rights value. Crane wrote to them immediately. He included in his letter the specific amount Damon had named. Naomi read the number and then read the letter from the beginning again to make sure she'd understood the sequence correctly. He went to our lawyer, Silas said. Yes. To offer a settlement. Yes. She set the letter down. Crane is our attorney. He has a legal obligation to present any settlement offer to us. He cannot keep it from us. She looked at Silas. But he is also not Damon's attorney. Damon appearing in Crane's office to negotiate directly, without his own legal representation present, while a petition is active. That is not how this process is supposed to work. Silas looked at her. At minimum, it's a significant procedural error, she said. At maximum, it could be characterized as an attempt to conduct improper negotiations outside the court process. She tapped the letter. Crane knows this. Look at his language here. He says he is reporting the contact as required, but notes the irregular nature of the approach. Crane thinks it helps us. Crane thinks it helps us very much, she said, because it suggests Damon believes his case is weaker than he's been presenting. You don't offer settlement on a partition case you're confident you're going to win. She sat back. The community meeting rattled him. The Hallett connection being public knowledge rattled him. He went to Crane because he's trying to cut his losses, and he did it sloppily because he's emotional now and not thinking clearly. Silas was quiet for a long moment. "Do we take it?" he said. She looked at him. The question was genuine. She could see him weighing it, the way you weighed anything that offered an exit from an ongoing war. "What do you want?" she said. "I want it to be over." "I know. But settling means paying him something for mineral rights that may or may not exist, on a case he may not be able to win, based on a petition that may be challengeable on fraud grounds." She kept her voice level. "If we settle, he gets money. If we fight, and Crane can establish the coordination with Hallett, he might get nothing. And the mining company might face legal exposure too." Silas pressed his hands flat on the table. "What's your read?" She thought about it honestly. Not what she wanted the answer to be, what she actually thought. "I think we don't settle," she said. "I think Crane believes we can win this. And I think Damon knows it, which is why he went to Crane's office." She paused. "But I want you to make this decision. This is your family's land. It was your father's." He looked at her for a moment. "It's yours now too," he said, quietly, without drama. She held that for a second. "Then I say we fight," she said. "We fight," he agreed. They wrote to Crane that day declining the settlement and authorizing him to proceed with the counter-challenge on the grounds of procedural irregularity and the Hallett coordination evidence. The letter went out with the next writer. 4 days after that, the writer came back with news from Fallow Creek. Crane had filed the counter-challenge, and a judge had issued a temporary injunction on the partition petition pending review of the fraud allegations. Damon's case was, for the moment, frozen. Silas read the letter in the yard, standing by the wagon, and Naomi watched him read it and watched his face do something she hadn't seen it do before. A slow, deep exhale, the kind that comes when something you've been holding for a very long time is set down. He looked up and found her watching. She didn't say anything, neither did he. But something passed between them that was more than the sum of all the practical conversations about the stove and the accounts, and the east wall, and the hay supply, and the meetings, and the letters. Something that was the recognition, on both sides, of what they had built in this rough house, on this rough land in this one hard winter together, and what it had cost them, and that the cost had been worth it. He folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket. She went back inside and started the afternoon work, which was what you did, because the ranch didn't stop needing things just because you'd gotten a piece of good news. And there was supper to start, and the lean-to roof still needed patching before the spring rains came. But she was smiling, slightly, while she worked. She didn't try to stop it. The injunction bought them time, but time on the frontier was never free. April arrived and brought with it the particular tyranny of spring work, the kind that couldn't be delayed or reasoned with, that showed up regardless of what else was happening in your life and demanded its due. The cattle needed moving to the spring pastures. The fence line in the east section that Naomi had noted from horseback in March needed repair before the herd got near it. The lean-to roof, which had survived winter through stubbornness and luck rather than structural integrity, finally surrendered a section to a wet, heavy snow in early April and came down on a Tuesday night with a sound like a slow argument reaching its conclusion. Silas was out on the roof the next morning. Naomi was on the ground handing up materials, her leg healed enough to walk without the crutch, but still complaining on uneven ground, and they worked through it the way they'd worked through most things, without a great deal of talking, with a clear understanding of what needed to happen and who was doing which part of it. It was Hector Moss who came by that afternoon, unsolicited, with 2 lengths of timber he said he had extra of, which Naomi understood immediately as something other than convenience. Hector wasn't a man who had extra timber lying around. He was a man who had gone and acquired timber and was presenting it as surplus, so the gesture didn't have to be acknowledged as what it was. She made coffee and let him and Silas work on the roof together and didn't make any comment about the timber, and when Hector left an hour later, Silas came in and sat at the table with the particular expression of a man who was still figuring out how to hold an unexpected thing. "He didn't have to do that," Silas said. "No," she agreed. "He did it anyway." He looked at her. "After the meeting." "After the meeting," she said. She didn't elaborate because she didn't need to. They both understood what the meeting had changed, and what it hadn't. It hadn't solved the legal case. It hadn't made the work easier or the land more forgiving, but it had done the quiet, essential thing of shifting where they stood in the community's reckoning. You couldn't put a number on that, but you could see it in a man showing up with timber he didn't have to bring. The court hearing date came through from Crane in the second week of April, late May. 7 weeks. Crane's accompanying letter was the most detailed he'd sent yet. 8 pages of dense preparation, laying out the argument they would make, and the evidence they would present, and the witnesses he had secured. The 2 men from Fallow Creek who had seen Damon meeting with Hallett's representative. A clerk from the county records office who had identified irregularities in the timing of Damon's filings, specifically that certain documents had been backdated in ways that didn't align with the postmarks on related correspondence. And a letter from the Hallett Mining Company itself, obtained through a legal process Crane described in technical language that Naomi read twice to understand, which showed that Hallett had recorded the Eastern Ridge as a planned acquisition target in their internal documents 4 months before Damon filed the partition petition. 4 months before. When the only people who could have given Hallett that information were the Mercer brothers themselves. She read that part to Silas at the kitchen table. He was quiet for a long time afterward. He planned this before Father was even a year in the ground, he said finally. It looks that way, she said. She watched him hold that. Silas Mercer was not a man who expressed grief easily or in obvious ways, but she had learned to read the other forms it took in him. The stillness, the jaw set at a particular angle, the way he looked at something he wasn't really seeing. This was grief underneath the anger, not just for the land, for a brother, for whatever version of that relationship he'd once believed in or hoped for. She didn't try to talk him through it. She just let it be what it was. After a while he said, I need to write to Crane about one more thing. What? There's a man named Pell. Works at the assay office in Fallow Creek. 3 years ago, before I ever heard of Hallett, Damon paid Pell to run a private assay on the Eastern Ridge. Never told me. He looked at the table. I found out by accident. Pell mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to me. I didn't think much of it at the time. Damon had always been interested in the land value in an abstract way. I thought it was just curiosity. Naomi stared at him. Silas, you need to tell me these things. I know. He said it without defensiveness, which was its own kind of progress from 6 months ago. Does Pell still have the assay report? I don't know, possibly. Write to Crane tonight, she said. Crane needs to find out if Pell has that report and if it can be subpoenaed. If Damon commissioned a private assay 3 years ago, that establishes the premeditation even further back than the Hallett documents. He wrote to Crane that night. Crane wrote back in 10 days. Pell had the report. Pell, when contacted by Crane's associate, had been persuaded, apparently without significant resistance, suggesting he had some existing discomfort with how the matter had been handled, to make it available to the court. The assay report showed confirmed silver deposits in the Eastern Ridge. Not speculative. Confirmed. The report was dated 3 years and 4 months ago, 14 months before their father died. Naomi sat with that information for a long time after Crane's letter arrived. She sat with it longer than she usually sat with anything, because it changed the shape of the whole story in a way that took some adjusting to. Damon hadn't started planning this after their father's death. He'd started planning it when their father was still alive. He'd had the assay done in secret, known about the silver, said nothing, and then waited. Waited for his father to die, waited for Silas to be deep enough into the isolation of running the ranch alone, waited for the right moment to file papers that would deliver the valuable piece of land to him through a legal process that would look, to a casual observer, like a reasonable family dispute. He'd been patient for years, and she had been right months ago at the kitchen table that his patience had finally broken at the community meeting, that losing the room's sympathy had cracked something in him that 3 years of careful planning hadn't prepared him for. Because he hadn't planned for her. She thought about that. She turned it over the way she turned most things over, looking at all the sides. Damon Mercer had built a plan for a Silas who was alone and tired and manageable. He had filed his petition against a household that he expected to be easy to destabilize. He had spread rumors about a woman he assumed would be embarrassed, uncertain, grateful to disappear. He had walked into a situation that he thought he understood completely, and every single assumption he'd made had been wrong. She didn't feel triumphant about this. That surprised her slightly. She'd expected, when the case started going their way, to feel something sharper. But what she actually felt was something quieter, a kind of steadiness, a settling, like a foundation curing, like the kitchen floor after she'd replaced the soft boards with solid ones and tested them under her full weight and felt them hold. May was the hardest month, though not because of the court case. The case was moving. Crane was preparing. The evidence was assembled. That part was in other hands now and had been handed off correctly, and all they could do was wait for the date. What made May hard was the ranch itself, which did not suspend its demands because they had a court hearing coming. They lost 3 head of cattle to a late cold snap in the first week. Not the 5 Silas had predicted as his winter loss, but still a financial blow that landed at a bad time. One of the horses came up lame. The kitchen garden that Naomi had started in early April, tentatively, given the altitude and the soil, showed promise in 2 beds and complete failure in the 3rd, and she spent an afternoon pulling dead seedlings and felt, briefly and specifically, the particular demoralization of a thing you'd worked on not working. She let herself feel it for about an hour. Then she turned the failed bed and amended the soil with manure from the barn and replanted with a hardier variety that Ruth Alderman had given her seeds for, with the note that they were ugly but reliable. Ruth had become something in these months that Naomi hadn't entirely anticipated. Not a close friend exactly, because both of them were too self-contained for close friendship to happen quickly, but a neighbor in the genuine old sense of the word, the sense that meant something out here. They saw each other every week or two. They exchanged seeds and information, and the kind of practical knowledge that wasn't written down anywhere and only existed because women had been passing it to each other across back fences and kitchen tables for generations. Ruth knew this land. She knew what grew and what didn't and why, what the weather did in each month, which merchants were honest, and which ones ran a short measure when they thought you weren't paying attention, which families in the area were struggling, and which ones were building something. She knew the history of Ash Ridge in the way of someone who had been present for most of it. And in May, Ruth told her something she hadn't known. They were in Ruth's kitchen one afternoon when Ruth said, without particular preamble, "You know the women in town have been talking." Naomi looked up from the seed catalog they'd been looking through together. "About what?" "About you." Ruth's expression was not concern. It was more like the expression of someone delivering information they consider to be good news but aren't certain will be received that way. Not the way they were talking in February. Different. Different how? "There's a woman named Carla Brent. Runs the school. She's been saying—" Ruth paused, seeming to select her words. "She's been saying that Ash Ridge needs women like you." Those were her words. Naomi set the catalog down. "She mentioned the meeting," Ruth said. "She mentioned what you said and how you said it. She's been talking to some of the other women about what it means for the town to have settled women who can do what you did." She turned her teacup. "There was talk before you arrived about the school, whether to expand it. There aren't enough children yet, but there will be, and Carla's been trying to get someone to help her manage the books and organize the enrollment process. She asked me if I thought you'd be interested." Naomi looked at Ruth for a moment. "The school?" "Just the administrative side. Numbers, records, enrollment. Carla does the teaching." Ruth met her gaze. "I told her I didn't know, that I'd mention it." Naomi thought about it. She thought about what it would mean. Not just the work itself, but the thing it represented. Being asked. Being considered someone worth asking. Not because she'd campaigned for it or performed anything, but because she'd been present and done what needed doing and people had noticed. "Tell her yes," she said. "Tell her I'll come in the first week of June." Ruth nodded, and something in her expression, small and genuine, told Naomi that this was what Ruth had hoped she would say. The hearing was on a Thursday in the last week of May. They rode to Fallow Creek the day before and stayed at a boarding house that smelled of pine resin and old fires, and Naomi lay awake for part of the night, not from anxiety exactly, but from the particular alertness that comes before something important, when your mind won't let you fully rest because it's still turning over the variables. Silas was asleep within 10 minutes of lying down, which was a quality she had first found baffling and now found almost enviable. The ability of a man who had worked physically all his life to simply stop when the day ended. She watched the ceiling and thought about Crane's preparation and the witnesses and the assay report and the Hallett letter and the partition petition and all the pieces laid out in sequence. And after a while, she stopped thinking about the case and thought instead about the morning she'd arrived at Ash Ridge Station and the man with the lopsided badge pointing at her and the laughter spreading across the platform. She thought about standing on that bottom step with her carpet bag and her whole life contained in it, and the sound of people deciding, before she'd spoken a single word, that she was a mistake. She thought about Silas walking through the middle of that laughter with the certainty of a man who had decided something. She had not known then what she was walking into. She had understood the practical realities, the hard winter, the isolated land, the uncertain marriage. She had not understood the legal war, the scheming brother, the community gossip, the broken leg, and the meeting and all of it. She had signed on for something she thought she understood and discovered that she had understood only the surface of it. But she had also discovered things she hadn't expected. The way a kitchen stove became familiar after you'd fought with it long enough. The way a man who barely spoke could communicate a great deal if you paid attention. The way a piece of land, worked and watched and worried over, started to feel like it knew you back. The way she had, without planning it or naming it, become something she hadn't been in Cincinnati. Not just useful, not just practical, but necessary. Present in a real way. Rooted. She fell asleep somewhere in that thought and slept until Silas was up and the light was coming gray through the curtain. The courtroom in Fallow Creek was smaller than she'd pictured. A plain room in the county building with wooden benches and windows that let in the morning light at an angle that put half the room in brightness and half in shadow. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Hara Folsom, which surprised both of them because female judges were not common in the territory, and Crane had not mentioned it, though when Naomi thought about it afterward, she understood that Crane had perhaps not thought it was information that would change their preparation, which was probably correct. Damon was there with a lawyer she didn't recognize, not the one who'd sent the original petition letter. A different one. Younger, visibly expensive, which told her that Damon had spent money he probably didn't have on a last attempt to recover what the case was already losing. Crane was exactly as she'd imagined from his letters. Compact, precise, with the quality of someone who said less than he knew in every room he entered, which she recognized as the right approach for a lawyer and probably for most situations. She sat beside Silas on the bench behind Crane, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she listened. The hearing took most of the day. She would not remember all of it in sequence afterward. It blurred in the way that long, important days sometimes do, running together into impressions and moments rather than a clean chronological record. What she remembered clearly were specific things. She remembered the moment Crane laid the assay report in front of Judge Folsom and said quietly that the document had been commissioned in secret by the petitioner 14 months before their father's death and never disclosed to his co-owner, and the quality of stillness that fell over the room when the judge looked at the date on the report. She remembered the two witnesses from Fallow Creek giving their accounts of seeing Damon with Hallett's man, and the way Damon's expensive new lawyer tried to suggest that business meetings were not evidence of conspiracy, and Crane responded by producing the Hallett internal document showing the Eastern Ridge listed as a planned acquisition before the petition was filed, and asking the court to consider the coincidence carefully. She remembered the backdated documents. The clerk from the county records office was precise and unhesitating, the kind of witness who was devastating because he had no stake in the outcome and was simply reporting what the paper record showed. And she remembered Damon's face when Judge Folsom asked him directly, with the particular directness of a woman who had presided over enough proceedings to be done with circumnavigation, whether he had disclosed the assay results to his brother at any point prior to filing the partition petition. Damon's lawyer started to object to the question. Judge Folsom looked at him in a way that ended the objection before it finished forming. Damon looked at his hands, then he said, "No." One word, quiet. And in that one word was the acknowledgement that everything Crane had built the case around was true. Judge Folsom ruled that afternoon. She ruled that the partition petition was dismissed. She ruled that the concealment of the assay results from a co-owner constituted a breach of fiduciary duty sufficient to void the jointly held property arrangement. She ruled that based on the evidence of coordination with a third-party buyer prior to the filing, the petition had been brought in bad faith. And she ruled, and this was the part that Naomi had not dared to hope for, that Crane had flagged as possible but not certain, that Silas Mercer was entitled to full ownership of the property, including the Eastern Ridge, on the grounds that his co-owner had attempted to defraud him of his share of its value. Full ownership. She heard Silas's breath change beside her. Just slightly. Just enough. She kept her hands folded in her lap and her face composed, and she did not cry, because she had not cried in the warehouse in Ash Ridge, and she was not going to cry in a courtroom in Fallow Creek. But there was something happening in her chest that was large and needed containing. Damon left without speaking to either of them. His lawyer followed. She watched them go and felt no particular thing about it. Not vindication exactly, not relief exactly, something more like the feeling of setting down a weight you'd been carrying so long you'd stopped noticing it until it was gone. Outside on the steps of the county building, Crane shook hands with both of them and said it had gone as well as it could have gone. And Silas said thank you in the way he said thank you when he meant it deeply. And Crane said the bill would follow by post and smiled in a way that suggested he knew the bill was going to be painful but not ruinous. Then Crane left and they were standing on the steps in the late afternoon light of Fallow Creek, and there was nothing left to do and nowhere they had to be until morning. Silas looked at her. She looked at him. Supper, she said. Yes, he said. They had supper at the only restaurant in Fallow Creek that was still open at that hour, which was not a fine establishment but had hot food and a warm room, and they sat across from each other at a small table and ate without hurrying and talked, for the first time in months, about something other than the case or the ranch or the next problem that needed solving. He asked her about Cincinnati, not in the prodding way of someone conducting an interview, but the way you ask about a place when you're genuinely curious about who the person across from you was before you knew them. She told him about her aunt, about the years of keeping the household, about the particular specific loneliness of being surrounded by people and mattering to none of them in any way that was real. She told it without self-pity because she didn't feel self-pity about it, but she told it honestly. He listened the way he did most things, completely and without interruption. She asked him about the ranch before her, about the 3 years alone, what that had actually been like. He thought about it for a long time before answering, which was also typical of him. Manageable, he said finally. Still, it wasn't. What changed? Winter before last. The cattle losses were bad, worse than this year. He looked at the table. I fixed everything that broke and kept working, and I was fine. But I started to notice, he paused. I started to notice that I was only thinking as far ahead as the next week, not further. Like I'd stopped believing there was a point to planning further. She thought about that. That's not fine. No, he agreed. It wasn't. Is it different now? He looked at her. Yes, he said, simply, without decorating it. She held that. Outside the window, the light was gone, and Fallow Creek's modest lights were reflected in the puddles left by an afternoon shower she hadn't noticed. She thought about the letter she'd read in Cincinnati with the worn folds. I need someone who can work alongside me. She had taken that as a description of a practical need, which it was. She had not understood then that it was also a description of something lonelier and more essential than practicality. She had not understood either what she was offering when she wrote back. But here was the thing that she had learned in this one hard year on this hard piece of land. You didn't have to understand a thing fully to do it right. You did the work in front of you. You paid attention. You didn't pretend to be something you weren't or expect the other person to be something they weren't. You stayed when it was difficult, not because staying was always comfortable, but because leaving would mean abandoning something real. And the real thing was what mattered. I'm not going anywhere, she said. She'd said it before in the kitchen months ago, in the context of the legal case. She said it again now, and it meant something different. He looked at her across the small table in the unremarkable restaurant in Fallow Creek and said, I know. 2 words, quiet. And they were the right 2 words. Summer came to the Mercer Ranch with the particular generosity that the frontier occasionally offered after a long, brutal winter, as if the land itself was acknowledging that it had asked a lot and was now prepared to give something back. The cattle came through the spring healthy. The east pasture fence line, repaired before the herd arrived, held through the season without incident. The kitchen garden, the 2 successful beds and the replanted third, produced more than Naomi had expected, and she spent 2 weeks in July putting things up, filling jars in the kitchen, learning as she went from a pamphlet Ruth had loaned her and from her own mistakes, which were educational and sometimes fragrant. She started at the school in June, as she'd told Ruth she would. Carla Brent was a small, sharp-eyed woman who had been teaching in Ash Ridge for 7 years and had, over that time, developed the particular confidence of someone who knows their work and doesn't feel the need to announce it. She and Naomi understood each other inside of 10 minutes, which was efficient and satisfying. The administrative work was genuine work. The enrollment records were a mess. The financial books hadn't been properly maintained in 2 years. And the process for requesting territorial education funding was labyrinthine in ways that seemed designed to discourage anyone from completing it. Naomi straightened the records and corrected the books, and worked through the funding application with the same systematic attention she'd brought to the ranch accounts. She went in twice a week. She met parents. She met children. She met the town in small increments, not at a community meeting under pressure, but in the ordinary way, over ordinary things, the way belonging actually happened if you let it. Some people were slow to warm. She didn't take it personally. Some people had believed the story Damon had told and were not sure how to walk it back, and she understood that embarrassment was not the same as bad faith. She was patient with it. She didn't require anyone to apologize. She just showed up and did what she'd come to do and let time handle the rest. Mabel Hutch at the Trading Post took until July to speak to her in a way that was genuinely direct rather than carefully pleasant. When it happened, over a question about flour prices that became a longer conversation about the Trading Post stock rotation, Naomi didn't mark the occasion in any visible way. She just answered the question and asked her own and let the conversation find its own level. And Mabel seemed relieved not to be made to acknowledge what she was doing. That was another thing the year had taught her. People needed room to change their minds without being watched doing it. You gave them that room, and you didn't make a point of noticing, and sometimes, if you were patient enough, they got there. The hearing's outcome had traveled through Ash Ridge quickly, because information always moved fast in small communities. The word fraud had attached to Damon's name in a way that couldn't be removed, and Damon himself had left the territory within a week of the ruling. Where he went, nobody said, and Naomi didn't ask because it didn't affect anything she needed to manage. What the ruling had done practically was change the financial picture of the ranch in a way that took her some time to fully absorb. Crane's bill was real and it was significant, but it was manageable against a property that was now wholly and unencumbered theirs. And the Eastern Ridge, which no one had formally offered on since the Hallett situation had become public, and the company had quietly withdrawn from the territory's land market, was simply part of what they owned, with whatever it held underneath it. Silas was not inclined to pursue the mining question. "I'm a rancher," he said when she raised it in July. "I run cattle. I don't know anything about mining, and I don't want to know anything about mining." "You might want to know what the ridge is worth," she said, "or I might want to just have it," he said. "Not sell it, not develop it. Just own it. Know it's there." She thought about that. "All right," she said. "We can revisit it in a few years." "We can revisit it never," he said, but there was something in his voice that wasn't quite as final as the words. She let it alone. She had learned which hills were worth dying on and which ones would take care of themselves with enough time. They went to the Belder market in August, as they'd planned in January when she'd found the outdated cattle prices. They drove 4 days to get there, camped twice on the trail, and arrived with 31 head, the same number they'd started spring with, a minor miracle of the season's relative mercy. She negotiated the price. Silas stood beside her at the buyer's table and let her work, which was what they'd agreed, and she worked. The buyer, a thick man named Durant, who had the practiced ease of someone who dealt with ranchers all day and knew every variation of the approach, looked at her with a particular quality of assessment when she sat down at his table, the kind of look that was calculating not hostility exactly, but leverage, seeing where the softness was. She didn't have softness on this question, and she let him see that early. She knew the market price. She knew the weight and grade of their cattle. She knew what Durant had paid the rancher before them, because she had listened to that transaction carefully from a distance while appearing to be occupied with other things. She knew the number she was willing to walk away from, and she knew the number she wanted, and she started from the right position, and she held it. Durant eventually said, "You're not what I expected." "That happens," she said. "Is that a yes?" It was a yes. The price was 23% above what Silas had gotten at his best previous sale. She did not do anything when they walked away from the table, no visible celebration, because a 23% improvement was not the occasion for celebration. It was the occasion for noting what you'd done right and making sure you did it the same way next year. But that evening, at the camp they made on the first night of the return journey, Silas built the fire and she made coffee, and they sat in the dark with the herd settling around them and the stars doing what frontier stars did, which was remind you of your scale in a way that could be either terrifying or comforting depending on what you brought to the conversation. "You were good in there today," he said. I was prepared, she said. It's not the same thing. It's not the same thing. She thought about that. Fair enough. He was quiet for a while. The fire settled. One of the cattle moved in the dark. I want to talk to you about something, he said. She looked at him. The ranch. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, which was the thing he did when he was working towards something that was harder to say than the practical conversations. What we're building, what it could be. He paused. I've been thinking about it differently since the hearing, since this year. Differently how? For 3 years I was just keeping it alive, keeping the water running and the cattle fed and the land from going back to nothing. Surviving. He looked at the fire. That's not the same as building something. She waited. I want to build something, he said. I want to expand the herd next year if the pasture can support it. I want to get the fencing right, properly right, not just serviceable. I want the house to be... He stopped. I want it to be a house, not just a structure that's standing. She held the quiet for a moment. The east wall is sound, she said. The floor is solid. The roof is patched. I want windows that fit, he said. I want a second room off the back before... He stopped again. She looked at him across the fire. Before we need it, he said. She understood what he was saying. They had not had that conversation directly, had circled it the way you circled things that were real and therefore required care, that you could damage by moving toward them too fast. She understood what before we need it meant, what he was thinking about when he looked at the house and saw it as a place that might become something larger. A second room is a reasonable improvement, she said. He looked at her with a quality of attention that she had learned over this year to recognize as the full version of what was usually a more partial kind of regard. Yes, he said. It is. They sat with that in the comfortable way of two people who understood what had been said without the words having been said. And the fire burned down, and the stars did what they did, and the cattle were settled around them, and it was enough for that evening. The second room was framed in October. They built it together on weekends with help from Hector Moss, who arrived on 2 consecutive Saturdays without being asked, and worked without fanfare and declined payment, and with lumber they had actually been able to afford properly this time, straight-grained and sound. Naomi worked beside them on both Saturdays, not as a helper exactly, but as a participant, handing things and holding things and making decisions about where the window would go and how the room would connect to the main house. When the frame was up, and the walls were rough closed and the roof tied in, she stood in the doorway of the new room and looked at it. The bare studs, the pale raw wood, the rectangle of sky visible through the single window opening before the glass was set, and felt something that was not completeness exactly, because nothing about her life had ever resolved into completeness, but was something like rightness, like a thing being what it should be. Ruth came to see it and said it was good work. Carla Brent came to see it and said they'd done it faster than she would have thought. Mabel Hutch sent, through Ruth, a set of curtain panels she said she had extra of, which was the same gesture as Hector's timber and meant the same thing, and Naomi accepted it in the same spirit, without making anyone name what they were doing. The room was plastered and floored by November. It would be ready by spring. The first snow of that second winter came in December again, exactly as it had the year before, but this time Naomi stood on the porch and watched it come down without the sensation of bracing that she'd carried through the whole of the previous year. She watched it the way you watched a thing you knew, not without respect, not without awareness of what it demanded, but without the particular fear that comes from not knowing what you're dealing with. She knew this snow now. She knew how it settled on the lean-to roof, and how the barn door would stick in the morning, and how many extra logs the kitchen stove would need to compensate for the drop in temperature. She knew how long the pump took to prime in freezing conditions, and what to do about the east wall if the wind shifted northeast, and where to check for icing on the path between the house and the barn that would make the morning trip treacherous. She knew this place. The knowledge had come at a cost that she could enumerate precisely. 1 broken leg, 6 months of accumulated exhaustion, a broken-down marriage negotiated into something real, a legal war conducted simultaneously with the work of keeping animals alive and floors from rotting and food on the table, an arrival that had been mocked, A winter that had been hard in the particular way that exposed everything you thought you were made of and required you to find out if you were right. She had been right mostly. Wrong in places she hadn't expected. Right in the places that mattered. Silas came out and stood beside her on the porch. "First snow," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, watching it fall. "Same as last year." "Not really," she said. He glanced at her. "Same snow," she said. "Different ground." He thought about that. She could see him turning it over in the way he turned things over, that unhurried thoroughness that had frustrated her for the first month, and that she had come to regard as one of the most reliable qualities she knew. "Yes," he said. "That's right." They stood on the porch and watched the snow come down on a ranch that was theirs completely, on a piece of land that was honest about what it asked of you, and the smoke from the kitchen stove rose straight up in the still air, and the cattle were settled in the barn, and there was food in the cellar for a long winter and a new room waiting behind them for what spring would bring. This is what Naomi Cross had learned, in the year that had made her and broken her and put her back together in a slightly different shape, that belonging was not given. It was not a thing that arrived with you or was offered at a door. It was built the way a kitchen floor was built, piece by piece, tested under your full weight, replaced where it was soft, maintained through every season. She had arrived as a stranger who was laughed at and left as someone the town knew, not loved by everyone, not without the complicated texture of real relationships with real people who sometimes got things wrong, but known, rooted, present in the way that mattered. She had come west for a practical arrangement and found something that couldn't be reduced to practical, and she had not been ruined by that surprise, but had simply expanded to include it, because that was what you did when life turned out to be larger than the container you'd built for it. She had thought once that no door opened for women who looked like her. She had been wrong about that. What was true was that certain doors didn't open easily. They required more of you. More patience, more work, more willingness to stand on the bottom step and breathe through the laughter and keep your chin level. But they opened. The snow came down on Ash Ridge territory and on the Mercer Ranch and on the eastern ridge where silver lay in the dark underneath the stone and wasn't going anywhere. And Naomi stood on her porch in the last light of a December afternoon and did not think about Cincinnati or rival platforms or a brother-in-law who had made every wrong assumption about who she was and what she could be made to accept. She thought about spring. She thought about what she was going to plant in the third garden bed, now that she knew the soil better. She thought about the cattle prices at Beller next August and what numbers she was going to start from. She thought about the second room and what it would hold, and about a conversation by a campfire that had said what it needed to say without saying it, and about a man who had walked through a crowd of laughter and decided something. She thought about all the work still ahead and felt, at the thought of it, not dread, but something closer to appetite. Inside, the stove was going. She could feel the warmth of it through the wall. She turned and went in.